I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 19 Good Times in Constantinople. We last left off with the death of Anastasius Dichoras. He had been chosen by the Empress Ariadne to become the emperor after the death of her husband Zeno. Anastasius had ascended to the throne at the ripe old age of 60, but he was strong in both body and willpower, so he managed to rule for almost 30 years. During those 30 years, Anastasius had revitalized the empire's finances and managed to stave off a Persian invasion. However, in Constantinople, his legacy was not so flawless. Anastasius had angered the people of the capital with his reforms that cut spending to the theater and circus, while also banning shows that included wild animals and night parties. He further alienated his subjects by reneging on his promise to uphold Christian orthodoxy in favor of his preferred belief in monophysitism. Ultimately, he left Constantinople much richer than he had found it, but had inflamed the anger that was beginning to become pervasive throughout the city. Into this volatile situation stepped Anastasius's chosen successor, the man who by all accounts had now become emperor simply by the whims of fate. This man had never hoped to become the most powerful man in the empire, but God and a little political maneuvering had allowed him to be elevated. His name was Justin, and just like his predecessor, he was quite old by the time the crown graced his head. At 68 years of age, Justin had already lived a full life. He had been born a peasant in the Balkan region of the Illyrian province. His family was of Thracian and Roman descent, so he only fluently spoke Latin and not Greek like the aristocracy. Despite his lack of education or valuable skills outside of herding pigs, Justin had dreams of breaking free from the dullness of peasant life. So when he was still young and full of vigor, he and two of his friends left their home to find their fortune in Constantinople. There weren't many prospects for men with no money and no connections in the capital, but the empire was always in need of people who were willing to carry a sword and possibly die in the name of the emperor. So Justin joined the palace guard and was eventually drafted into the military to serve on campaigns in the east. It was through the gauntlet of war that Justin was able to make a name for himself, despite his humble origins, and a lengthy career path eventually led to him becoming commander of the palace guard in the final years of Anastasius's reign. Now we already went over the likely fictional story of Anastasius, believing that the first man to enter his chambers in the morning would become the next emperor. But in reality, Justin only became emperor by outmaneuvering several other candidates. These included Anastasius's brother, his three nephews, and another commander of the guard named Theocritus. In the end, Justin's support in the military and his well-placed bribes to the imperial council allowed him to prevail over his much higher-born and better-educated opponents. At the time of his coronation, Justin was married to a woman named Lupicia. According to a very biased and salacious contemporary source, Lupicia was a barbarian slave who was the concubine of a man that Justin met during his time in the military. Justin had reportedly bought her from her master and married her despite her being probably of the lowest social stature of anyone in the empire. This source can neither be proven nor disproven, and he has a clear vendetta against the future empress. Another way to look at it is that Lupicia would not give Justin any dowry or improve his standing among the aristocracy, showing that this was a marriage for love, not politics. It makes the two more virtuous in hindsight. Upon being crowned empress in 518, Lupicia had her name changed to Euphemia in order to appear more respectable to the Christian faithful. Euphemia was the name of an important Orthodox saint, and while the Empress Euphemia would largely be ignored by history, she is cited as having a strong influence over Justin's religious policies that were a cornerstone of his reign. Justin and Euphemia were both elderly by the time they became emperor and empress, and their marriage had not produced any children. In order to secure his succession from the jump, Justin adopted his nephew, Justinian, to be his legal son and heir. This meant that when Justin died, Justinian would be the sixth emperor in a row who was not a natural-born son of the previous emperor. This time at least he was from the same family. But I am getting a bit ahead of myself, as we still have to go through Justin's reign. While much shorter than Anastasius's, Justin's time on the throne would be no less action-packed and quite a shift in tone. Justin was extremely different from his predecessor in a couple important ways. For one, he was a career soldier and had no experience in administration, other than what he had overheard while serving as a palace guard. Justin was aware of this lack of expertise, and so he relied heavily on advisors to guide his hand. Chief among these was Justinian, who had grown up in Constantinople and was eager to test his knowledge of politics and bureaucracy before his official time in the big chair. In some ways, Justin's reign was a soft launch for Justinian, but he still deserves credit for recognizing the talent of his nephew and following his advice. The other side of the surround yourself with good advisors coin is the remove negative influences. Justin was just as proactive in this regard as he was to selecting his friends. Within a couple weeks of his coronation, all the major candidates that had opposed him during the succession were executed. Justin made sure that he also purged the imperial court of any strong Monophysite adherents. The other way that Justin differed from Anastasius was that he was a staunch supporter of Orthodox Christianity, and he believed it was high time the imperial government reflected the faith that he and the majority of the capital followed. By the time Justin ascended to the throne, the schism that Zeno and Acacian had caused by repudiating the Council of Chalcedon had been ongoing for 34 years. The Patriarch of Constantinople, John of Cappadocia, had only been given his position by Anastasius after he agreed to condemn the Council of Chalcedon, against his better judgment. But now there was a true believer in the Chalcedonian position sitting on the throne, and the work could begin on mending the rift between Constantinople and Rome. The leading voice within the emperor's council on this matter was of course Justinian, and he urged his uncle to invite the pope to the capital so that they could hash this whole thing out. Pope Hormisdas did not want to personally travel east, perhaps in fear of Monophysite assassins, but he sent envoys with direct orders to simply state the church's position on the matter and to not enter negotiations. Justin capitulated to their demands, again at the urging of Justinian, and brought the matter to the final arbiter, John of Cappadocia. The Patriarch was reluctant to just simply accept the Pope's position without discussion or debate, not because he disagreed with the Orthodox viewpoint, but because it made Constantinople look like a junior partner to Rome. Eventually, the need to end the schism overcame any misgivings John had, and the rift was officially mended in March of 519. While the end of the schism meant that the Christian church was now more unified, it conversely damaged relations between Constantinople and its client king who ruled in Italy. We last spoke about King Theodoric in episode 17 during Zeno's reign, when he was goaded by the emperor into ousting the current rulers of Italy and establishing an Ostrogothic kingdom there that would pledge fealty to the Byzantines. The relationship between Constantinople and the Ostrogoths was built on shaky ground, but it was held up by the fact that the Goths ruled over a majority Roman population, who were only content in living under a king that was subject to the imperial court. During Anastasius's reign, there was a complex network of religious relationships that made everyone distrust each other, but also made no faction powerful enough to sway the situation to their favor. The Pope was a Chalcedonian adherent, and he held the power over the general population of Italy. Theodoric and his people were Arians, and he held power over the strongest military force in Italy. Anastasius was a Monophysite, and he held power over the Roman aristocracy, while also representing a military threat to the Ostrogoths. While they were all members of the Christian faith, none of the leaders saw the other's vision of Christianity as anything but heresy. Conflict was only avoided by the assurance that any move against one would see reaction from the other, and so the delicate balance was maintained. Then Anastasius died, Justin ascended, the schism was resolved, and now the Pope and the Emperor were reunited against the Arian Ostrogoths. Justin did nothing to stabilize the situation, as he followed the guidance of his wife and his nephew, and instituted persecution of both Monophysites and Arians. The edict against Monophysites only lasted 3 years before Justin realized that they were too entrenched in the eastern provinces, and any attempt at dislodging them wouldn't be worth the cost in manpower or money. But the persecution of Arians continued, and brought the ire of Theodoric down upon Justin. He was not yet willing to commit to a holy war against his benefactor in Constantinople, so he made the initial step of commanding the Pope to personally travel to the imperial capital and get the emperor to allow Arians freedom of worship. By this time, the strong-willed and forceful Pope, who had demanded complete deference to Rome on the Chalcedonian question, had died and been replaced by Pope John I, who was by all accounts quite frail and easily swayed. When he arrived in Constantinople, Pope John was showered with gifts and shown great reverence by Justin's court. The emperor even went as far as to insist that he be recrowned by the Pope to show his desire to serve God and his agent on earth. By the time all the feasts and games had ended, the Pope had neglected to move Justin even an inch on the Arian issue. Maybe he had been distracted by the grandeur of Constantinople and forgotten to broach the subject with Justin, or maybe his heart just wasn't really in it from the start. He was, after all, not an Arian himself, and agreed with the emperor on just about every other tenet of Christian belief. Needless to say, upon returning to Theodoric with news that the persecution of Arians would continue, he was promptly thrown into prison by the king and would stay there until he died. Before Theodoric could press the issue again, this time likely with an Ostrogothic army instead of a frail pope, the Gothic king died and was succeeded by his 10-year-old grandson, who was in no position to make any sorts of demands of the Byzantines. As we will continue to see, religion was the brick that Justin used to build all of his policies out of. From the domestic to the foreign, everything was couched in Christian iconography or the belief in a united Christian world under the rule of a Christian emperor. This idea was not new in the history of Constantinople, but it saw a renaissance under Justin and later Justinian's reign. It would also be the blueprint in which many medieval kingdoms and empires would build themselves in the image of. I won't go into too much detail on the foreign front, as it only is loosely connected to Constantinople. The strongest connection between the far-off provinces of the east and west to the capital is that with the renewed hostilities in both the Ostrogoths and the Sassanids, the Byzantine Empire was spread thinner than ever before. Because of this, the capital was much more vulnerable to attack, as now danger loomed on multiple fronts. Justin may have fashioned himself as a servant of God, but he did not have godly powers to raise massive armies from clay or rock to defend his borders in Constantinople. Instead, he relied on cultivating alliances with Christian neighbors who could act as a bulwark against his enemies. In particular, there were a number of Christian nations within the Persian sphere of influence who were open to the idea of switching to the Byzantine side because of their shared faith. The smaller Christian states were enticed into becoming client states of Constantinople, but Justin also made headway in securing favorable relations with the large Christian kingdom of Aksum in East Africa. The diplomatic efforts of Justin and Justinian meant that when the next war with Persia broke out, they would not be fighting them alone. But during Justin's time, there was still peace between the two great Eastern empires, though future conflict remained inevitable. If Justin wasn't fighting any major wars in the 9 years he was on the throne, then what was he doing with that mountain of gold Anastasius left him? Well, for one thing, he and his court were not boring old misers like the previous administration. Justin's reign saw the return of many of the games and parties that Anastasius had viewed as immoral and banned. In particular, the games that Justinian held to celebrate his consulship in the year 521 were the greatest ever put on in Constantinople's hippodrome. They cost upwards of 3,700 pounds of gold, about 1% of the imperial treasury. These spectacles and massive expenditures were not just frivolous hedonism. Justinian recognized that after nearly 30 years of being forced to go through life without the pleasures of circuses and feasts, the people of Constantinople would come to resent the emperor, and they had no outlet to vent their frustration. Anastasius had witnessed for himself what happened when you don't distract your people with entertainment. As we saw last episode, his tenure was marked by increasingly violent demonstrations by the citizens of the capital. Now that the games had returned, Justin did not have to deal with any major riots during his time on the throne. However, Justinian would live to see the blowback as circuses went from placating the mob to winding it up later down the line. But that will be for the future. For now, good times were rolling in Constantinople. On the flip side, times in Constantinople's eastern competitor had never been worse. Since its founding by Seleucus way back in the Hellenic Age, Antioch had been a jewel of the eastern Mediterranean. For a time, it was rivaled only by Alexandria in beauty, wealth, and importance. Unlike its Egyptian adversary, Antioch managed to maintain its stature throughout the entire Roman period and into the Middle Ages. During this time, its principal contender became not Alexandria, but the imperial capital of Constantinople. While Constantinople remained a predominantly Christian city, Antioch was an important location for both pagans and Christians within the Roman Empire. This included many important monophysites, and the rivalry between the two cities could be exemplified in the rivalry between the Orthodox and the monophysite view. It was able to support both communities and drew strength from each one while staving off complete civil strife. As Constantinople started to rise, first architecturally and then within the Christian faith, Antioch remained neck and neck. Its own position only began to falter when the wars between the Romans and the Persians became less frequent and then eventually stopped. Antioch had often become a temporary capital for the empire during the campaigns against the Persians due to its advantageous position in the east. Still, even leading up to the reign of Justin, Antioch rivaled Constantinople in cultural significance and population. That all changed in 526, when a massive earthquake struck Antioch. Most of the buildings in the city were destroyed, and an estimated 250,000 people died. It is hard to get accurate population numbers for places during this time period, but we can assume that the 250,000 figure, if not factually correct, does imply that a significant portion of the city's population perished. This natural disaster became the other major expenditure during Justin's reign, as he attempted to rebuild the city and repopulate it. His efforts were admirable, but it was all for naught as a second earthquake hit in 528 and erased the tremendous effort that had already taken place. Antioch would never again reach the heights it had during antiquity, and Constantinople now clearly surpassed it in size and importance. This tragedy has echoes in our modern day, as 1500 years after this disaster, Antioch was once again hit by earthquakes in 2023 that destroyed a large portion of the city. The disaster in Antioch was the final chapter of Justin's brief story. Like I said before, his reign was a bit of a footnote, or a ramping up to his nephew's time on the throne, that would be the most famous and in some cases infamous reign of any Byzantine sovereign. Justin has the unhappy fate of being sandwiched between the much more interesting figures of Anastasius and Justinian, but I believed it was important not to skip over him. It can often be enticing to study history by leapfrogging between the big dramatic moments, but a true understanding of the course of history can only come from a full understanding of the causes of such events. Would Justinian's reign have been so significant if his uncle hadn't set the stage for him? In some ways, Justinian set the stage for himself, as we have seen. As his uncle's chief advisor, he was pulling the strings of the empire long before he was crowned emperor, certainly during the last years of Justin's reign, when his mental ability went on a downward spiral. Still, Justin was his own man, with agency to shape history, even if the shaping he did was more subtle than his successor. The end of the emperor's story does not mean the end of this episode, as it usually has for this series. There is still a bit of time I want to fill, and so for the remainder of this episode, I want to go into greater detail on the life of Justinian leading up to when he is crowned in Constantinople in the year 527. Justinian was born in Thrace in the year 482 to Vigilantia, the sister of Justin. His biological father was named Sebastius, and both he and Vigilantia raised their son under the Roman tradition of their ancestors. That meant that Justin's first language was Latin, not Greek, as most emperors of the Byzantine Empire would be from now on. When Justin was still a young boy, his uncle became commander of the Imperial Guard. This meant that now Justin had enough political power and money to need to ensure both his future and the future of his family. He had no sons of his own, and his wife was too old to consider having a child, and so Justin sent word to his sister, telling her to send Justinian to Constantinople to be adopted into Justin's family. There isn't much written about how Vigilantia and Sebastius felt about this arrangement, but they were most likely conflicted. On one hand, they probably did not want to see their only son whisked away to the capital to serve as the heir to another man. On the other hand, they were poor provincial farmers with very little money, and so this was probably Justinian's best chance at getting a good education and making something of himself. In the end, Justin got his way, and Justinian arrived in Constantinople to begin being groomed for his future career. Justinian flourished in the Byzantine capital, absorbing knowledge like a sponge and becoming well-versed in imperial politics. He quickly came to the attention of the most powerful people in Constantinople, and was eventually able to secure a position in the Scolae, or the personal bodyguards of the emperor.
This was more than just an honorary position, as now Justinian would be able to witness the deep inner workings of the empire and got to learn from Anastasius, possibly one of the greatest administrative minds in the empire's history. While he was passively learning, Justinian was also actively building connections within the imperial court, but he was clever enough to realize that the time was not quite right for him to make the big jump from lowly bodyguard to emperor. Instead, he gathered his connections and intelligence in favor of his uncle, and when Anastasius passed away, it was Justinian who was the real driving force behind Justin's ascension. In return for his help, Justin immediately raised Justinian to the rank of patrician and gave him the title Count of the Domestics. This effectively made Justinian the most powerful member of the court and allowed him to dictate the course of Justin's reign from the shadows. Well, from the shadows carries a connotation that Justin was doing what he was doing out of an egotistical thirst for power. Like all great men of history, Justinian was not short on ego, but we can see from the policies he proposed while Count of the Domestics that he was not simply interested in power for power's sake. He had a real dream of bringing the empire and Constantinople back into their glory days. And heck, if he needed to stab a few backs and grease a few palms to do it, didn't the ends justify the means? We already discussed one of the great achievements of Justin's reign that had been orchestrated by Justinian, the end of the Acacian Schism. However, there was one detail of it that I would like to highlight to show that Justinian was able to discard his pride for the greater good. The schism officially ended when Patriarch John of Cappadocia held a ceremony in Hagia Sophia, where he stated that Rome and Constantinople would be reunited under one faith, that the teachings of the Monophysites were heretical, and in a symbolic gesture, the names of Zeno and Anastasius were struck from the diptychs. The diptychs were a list of important church figures that were honored during the Eucharist, and among others they held the names of all the past Christian emperors. It was a monumental display of deference to the power of the Pope to have two former emperors removed from the diptychs. Not only did the nature of the end of the schism place Constantinople under the authority of the Roman Church, but it also placed the Byzantine emperors under the Pope. It is likely that Justinian was not happy about this development, but he knew that healing the church was more important than the pride of the imperial office, at least for now. If Justinian's story had ended here, he would possibly still be seen as one of the greatest administrators and political movers of the Byzantine Empire. Even if his story didn't end here, but he continued alone into his own reign, he would have still likely done a number of the great things that he is remembered for, and go down as one of the good rulers of the Middle Ages. But as fate would have it, just a few years after his crowning achievement of ending the schism, Justinian would meet someone who all but guaranteed his name would be forever remembered as one of the greatest men in history. And how fitting is it that one of the great men would be elevated by an equally ambitious and talented woman? Again, we return to the theme of powerful women shaping the history of Constantinople, yet not quite receiving as much credit as their male counterparts. Yet unlike the empresses of the past, Justinian's partner would come not from the imperial family or aristocracy, but from the lowest of stations in the empire. The future Empress Theodora was born to a dancer and a bear trainer in Constantinople around the year 490. Her father, the bear trainer, was named Acacius, and her mother was not deemed important enough to have her name recorded. Back in those days, being an entertainer was about the lowest profession in the social hierarchy, about par with prostitution. Theodora and her two sisters were raised in Constantinople, with the expectation that they would follow in their mother and father's footsteps and become entertainers. From a young age, Theodora showed promise as an actor, but the meager wages she acquired were not enough to help support the family. So as she reached adolescence, Theodora was forced to begin work in a brothel, servicing a wide variety of patrons, including those of a much higher class. Theodora was as natural a prostitute as she was an actor. In some ways, the two professions share similar skills, but she found that being an object of sexual desire afforded her a more lavish lifestyle and the opportunity to mix with the upper class. Most of the contemporary and even later historical sources fixate on Theodora's supposed promiscuity, and we can see clear bias against the free spirit of Theodora. She was not the icon of virtue that so many male Christian historians venerate in their accountings of Constantinople. It is likely that the depictions of Theodora's so-called sins are greatly exaggerated, but we can assume that she was at least a little bit, shall we say, morally loose. But we can hardly blame her. The unfortunate fact is, for women of her low birth, there are hardly any options to improve their station. Theodora recognized her own talent and had the stomach to endure being used by those more powerful than her, but in turn she would use them to further her own ambition. Her first big break came when she caught the attention of a Syrian official named Hecabulus. She swiftly charmed her way into his inner circle, and when he left Constantinople to become governor of the Libyan province, he took her with him as his concubine. Unfortunately, this was not the vacation or the step up the social ladder that Theodora had hoped for. The two lovers were prone to extended arguments, and after a particularly violent one, she was thrown out of the governor's residence with nothing but the clothes on her back. Now Theodora was stuck in Africa with no money and no connections. The one thing she did have was her special set of skills, which she used to make her way along the coast until she reached Alexandria. Here, she had the fortune of being noticed by some high-ranking church officials. Through these men, she eventually became acquainted with the Patriarch of Alexandria, a man named Timothy. He preached to her the importance of her immortal soul and the stain that prostitution had left on it, but offered to cleanse her spirit if she repented. It is unclear if Theodora had a true coming-to-God moment here, but it is obvious that she began rethinking her priorities, as after Alexandria she would fashion herself as a refined jewel of beauty rather than a purely sexual object to be used and discarded. This is how she would both ingratiate herself to the more distinguished people in power, while also allowing her to use her considerable intellect to become indispensable to them. What was consistent through Theodora's transformation from lowly prostitute to high-class courtesan was her loyalty to the Blue Circus faction. Her family had worked for them since her father's untimely death, and she remained in close contact with their agents during her time in Africa. One interesting note about this is that she was baptized as a monophysite by Timothy, who was himself a monophysite. If you recall, the Blue Party was supposedly the party of Orthodox Christianity, but it would seem that that distinction was not exclusionary. It was through one of these blue agents that Theodora was first introduced to the Count of Domestics, a certain Justinian. For his part, Justinian was immediately taken by Theodora's beauty and confidence. As they got to know each other, Justinian also found in her a kindred spirit in terms of ambition and intelligence. It was truly a match made in heaven, but there were still two obstacles that prevented the unity of the future emperor and empress. One was Justinian's adoptive mother, the Empress Euphemia, who strongly objected to her son marrying a former actress. Another roadblock was the law, which stated that it was illegal for actors to marry someone of senatorial rank. The fact that Theodora was no longer an actress had no weight, as the profession carried a black mark that lasted a lifetime. Of these two obstacles, Euphemia was by far the most daunting. For a man with as much power as Justinian, the law was as changeable as soft clay, but his mother was bedrock that could not be overcome. Euphemia remained obstinate until 524, when she passed away. After that, it was just a simple matter of Justinian convincing his uncle to rewrite the law to say that former actors could marry outside their social rank as long as the emperor approved of the union. So in 525, Theodora and Justinian were finally married in Hagia Sophia. Only 2 years later, Justin passed away at the age of 77. Having already been proclaimed co-emperor earlier that year, Justinian ascended to the throne as sole ruler. But he would not remain there alone for long. Upon his ascension, he crowned Theodora as an Augusta. She would not be a simple empress consort, relegated to popping out future heirs and attending to the imperial palace. Instead, she would rule alongside her husband as an equal. Well, almost as an equal. Along with the mountain of gold he inherited from Justin, who had in turn inherited it from Anastasius, Justinian also inherited his uncle's enlightened recognition that an emperor was only as good as the people in his court. The brain trust of Theodora and Justinian was soon joined by a number of geniuses of the day that we will get to explore more fully in the future episodes. For now, I think this is a good stopping point. Next time, we will really get into the nitty-gritty of the incredibly dense story of Justinian's reign and how, other than Constantine, he changed Constantinople more than anyone else. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.